Thomas was convicted on 52 charges, including 7 of murder. His trial was one of the biggest and most complex gang prosecutions in the province.
The only 2 ways the career of a brutal drug lord can end is in prison or in a coffin. People like El Chapo, Miguel Angel Gallardo, and George Geweld Thomas became so self-absorbed in their own power that they never thought they would get arrested. When they did, well, their faces spoke millions. Let's explore the arrest and trials of the most notorious narcos and see how they reacted to their reckoning day. El Padrino. We can't make a notorious narcos list without speaking of El Padrino, aka the Godfather or the boss of bosses. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo was born on January 8, 1946 in Culiacan, Mexico. Unlike his famous counterparts like Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, or El Mencho, Miguel wasn't a farmer's boy or a school dropout. In fact, he graduated from high school and studied business in college. Then, he took a job as a Mexican federal judicial police agent. It was this job that landed him a new job as a family bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa State, Leopoldo Sanchez Salis. One thing led to another, and the governor's political connections helped Miguel build his drug trafficking organization. This would be known as the Guadalajara cartel, and it was Mexico's first modern-day cartel. And to put an explanation behind his nickname, Miguel was the godfather of Sanchez Salis' son, Rodolfo. Of course, his nickname also meant he was the boss. El Padrino started working for drug traffickers, brokering the corruption of state officials. He founded his cartel in the late 1970s together with Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, who previously worked in the Aviles criminal organization. After Pedro Aviles was killed in a police shootout, Miguel and his partners monopolized trafficking routes and established a bigger-than-ever cartel based on bribery and zero tolerance against theft, disloyalty, and the police. That, however, would bring their downfall and El Padrino's arrest. Miguel and Rafael were also the first Mexican drug lords to think, hey, we can work together with the Colombian cartels to ship white powder into the United States. Needless to say, it was an excellent decision, financially speaking. Throughout the 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel controlled most of the drug trafficking in Mexico and the corridors along the U.S. border. It had operations in regions from Jalisco to Baja California, Colima, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Sinaloa, just to name a few. The notorious Tijuana, Juarez, and Sinaloa cartels originally started out as branches or plazas of the Guadalajara cartel. Yep, this was the beginning of El Chapo's drug empire. But the more illicit money you make, the more you attract the police attention, right? As the Guadalajara cartel grew in size and power, the Mexican government as well as the DEA became more interested in stopping their operations. In 1984, DEA agent Kiki Kamara led a huge operation against the cartel. In 1984, acting on information from the DEA, 450 Mexican soldiers backed by helicopters destroyed a 1,000-hectare or 2,005-acre marijuana plantation in Allende, Chihuahua, known as Rancho Búfalo, with an estimated annual production of $8 billion. It's easy to see how Guadalajara kingpins were angered by this stint. They just lost a massive chunk of their business in a blink of an eye. And we all know how vengeful cartels can be. It's an eye for an eye and an eye for an eye until someone dies in a really gruesome way. On February 7, 1985, a group of police officers in El Padrino's pocket kidnapped Kiki Kamara in broad daylight and dragged him to Rafael Quintero's safe house. Side note, things like this simply didn't happen back then. It's said they've now been normalized because of vile cartels like the Sinaloa or the CJ&G. For 30 hours, Kiki was tortured in the most stomach-turning ways imaginable. When he lost consciousness, a doctor on site would bring him back to life so he could feel everything. Finally, he was murdered. The cartel didn't even want to extract information from him. They just wanted to punish him from destroying their business. But by taking Kiki's life, the Guadalajara cartel dug their own hole. A month later, Kiki's body was found wrapped in plastic in a rural side of Michoacan. His skull had been punctured by a piece of rebar and his ribs were broken. The consequence was the DEA's largest homicide investigation to this day. When the DEA traced the murder back to El Padrino and Rafael Quintero, they decided the Guadalajara would be turned to ashes. While Kiki Kamara received tons of posthumous awards and mentions, the Guadalajara bosses were systematically arrested, killed, and forgotten. El Padrino was arrested in Mexico on April 8, 1989 and was charged by the authorities in Mexico and the United States with the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. as well as racketeering, drug smuggling, and multiple violent crimes. Within days of his arrest, 90 police officers deserted and dozens of others were arrested for huge-scale corruption. He was initially sentenced to 40 years in prison. It was practically a life sentence since he was well into his 40s by the time he started trial. But here's the catch. El Padrino continued to rule his cartel from prison via phone. He realized the Guadalajara cartel wasn't going to stand, not with all the bosses in prison or dead. So he instructed his lawyers to convene with Mexico's top drug lords at the house in Acapulco and break the cartel into already existing plazas, naming the new bosses. The Tijuana cartel would go to his nephews, the Arellano Felix brothers. The Ciudad Juarez Plaza would go to the Carrillo Fuentes family, and El Chapo, El Guerrero, and El Mayo would form the Sinaloa cartel. In 1993, El Padrino was taken to a high-security prison where he lost all control over his cartel. In fact, he remained in solitary confinement for most of his life, and in 2017, a retrial sentenced him to an additional 37 years. Following this, El Padrino decided to break to the media for the first time since his 1989 arrest. He was in very bad shape.
Mi salud es pésima. Mi familia está haciendo un hoyo para yo ser enterrado en un árbol. No tengo pronóstico de vida ninguno.
Apart from complaining about his health and spending over 3 decades in a tiny cell, El Padrino claimed he was innocent. Indeed, only now people got to see his actual reaction to his life sentence. Miguel refused responsibility for murdering Kiki and, well, everything else.
Es una eternidad para un hombre que no cometió ningún delito.
El Padrino also complained about his arrest. Reportedly, the cops broke 4 of his ribs in front of his family after they tore down the door. Then, it got even worse.
O sea, no visitas, no locutorios, no abogados. No sé ni por qué estoy.
That's horrible. But torturing and killing a DEA agent and running a giant cartel is also horrible. Still, he denies his involvement.
Señor Camarena, quienes fueron, quienes hayan sido, hay autores materiales, intelectuales, presos. Ignoro el por qué se me relaciona.
In September 2022, El Padrino was granted house arrest by Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Obrador said, "I don't want anyone to suffer. I do not want anyone to be in jail." Age 77, El Padrino's health is declining rapidly, and the president granted him the wish to spend his last years beside his family. El Chapo. On April 4, 1957, Joaquin Archibald Guzman Lorera was born to a poor farmer's family in a very tiny village called La Tuna in the Sinaloa municipality in Mexico. El Chapo means shorty. He was a short, stocky kid who liked playing pranks, but he was also the son of a violent, abusive father who dabbed in the drug trade. So Chapo was only a teenager when he started working for El Padrino. In a way, it was his escape from home. In another way, he was mirroring his father. He had exceptional tunneling skills, which helped the Guadalajara expand their smuggling routes and go undetected for years. Thanks to El Chapo and his new buddy El Mayo, the Guadalajara cartel hugely increased their profits. They would become trusted members, and this allowed them to form their own cartel, the Sinaloa, with Padrino's blessing from prison. In just a few years, they raised the Sinaloa to Mexico's most powerful cartel. This title still stands today, even with El Chapo in prison, thanks to his 4 eldest sons.
The most powerful is the Sinaloa cartel. Almost the 70% of the world is infected by this cartel.
However, El Chapo didn't get to the top via charm and business savvy. He bribed, killed, and maimed anyone who opposed him, from rival cartel drug lords to police officers and high-ranking officials who threatened to arrest him. But when you do that, you will end up arrested sooner or later. In 1993, El Chapo was arrested for the first time after he was linked to the murder of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo, a huge figure of the Catholic Church in Mexico and, of course, someone who spoke out against El Chapo. The Guatemalan government extradited El Chapo to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison at the Altiplano prison in Juarez. Mexico's government actually thought this might be the end of the Sinaloa cartel, just like in the case of the Guadalajara. Arrest the kingpin and let the cartel crumble into warring factions, but they were very wrong. The prison wasn't exactly strict on El Chapo. He was still able to conduct his business from prison over the phone or by receiving visitors. El Chapo had a lot of officials in his pocket. This meant that he had better conditions than anyone else. Reportedly, he had contraband smuggled into prison on a daily basis, and because of this, in 2001, El Chapo was able to escape in a laundry cart carried outside of the prison by a maintenance worker named Javier Camberos. After a long investigation, it was revealed that a staggering 78 people were involved in this escape, and El Chapo had paid them $2.5 million in total. It took Mexican authorities 13 more years to catch El Chapo again. In February 2014, he and El Mayo were tracked down to a family reunion in Sinaloa. After his second arrest, El Chapo was transferred to the maximum security facility at La Palma or Altiplano prison in a Black Hawk helicopter. News of his arrest traveled fast, and this time, the American government insisted that El Chapo be extradited to the US so that he couldn't bribe his way out of prison again. But the Mexican government felt offended by this proposal. They responded by saying it would take hundreds of years before El Chapo would be extradited. Ironically, though, El Chapo would escape a second time.
This is the tunnel that Joaquin and Chapo Guzman came out of. We're gonna go down and take a closer look.
Como se informó la madrugada el día de ayer en el Centro Federal de Readaptación Social número 1, Altiplano, se registró la fuga de Joaquín Guzmán Loera, quien estaba ubicado en el área de tratamientos especiales, pasillo número 2, estancia número 20.
The situation was pretty clear. Once again, Chapo had bribed guards to help him escape. Obviously, the tunnel hadn't been built overnight, and El Chapo didn't use his own hands to dig. He wouldn't have had the time or means to make such a state-of-the-art passage. Reportedly, Altiplano prisoners were filmed inside their cells 24/7. So when El Chapo was arrested a third time in January 2016, Mexico was happy to send him to the US. However, he didn't go easily. The night he was located in Los Mochis, El Chapo was stopped in traffic by 4 officers. He attempted to bribe them. When they refused, he told them calmly, "You're all going to die." El Chapo was still confident he was in control, or he was still truly desperate to stay free. However, when the police heard El Chapo had an army of 40 sicarios coming to rescue him, they took him to a motel and called for backup. During the raid, 5 gunmen were killed, 6 others arrested, and 1 Marine was wounded. The Mexican Navy said that they found 2 armored cars, 8 assault rifles, including 2 Beret M82 sniper rifles, 2 M16 rifles with grenade launchers, and a loaded rocket-propelled grenade launcher. A year later, in January 2017, El Chapo was extradited to the US. Look at the fear on his face as he landed in the States. His face speaks volumes. He knew he couldn't bribe his way out of the US prison, and he knew this was the end of his freedom. It would definitely be a life sentence for a notorious drug lord linked to hundreds of murders and escaping prison twice. After a 2-year-long trial, he was found guilty of a very long list of charges: murder, money laundering, engaging in continuing criminal enterprise, drug manufacture, trafficking, using a firearm in furtherance of drug crimes, and the list goes on. During his trial, lots of Chapo's former employees spoke out against him and revealed a chilling fact. El Chapo took pleasure in personally torturing and killing his enemies. His sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the country's highest security federal prison, the ADX Florence in Colorado. El Chapo was not happy to hear this sentence. To this day, he's fighting to appeal his sentence by proving his rights are somehow being violated in prison.
This is an uphill battle for El Chapo, but the man nicknamed Shorty tonight is in a do-or-die situation. The convicted Sinaloa cartel boss, who was responsible for 80% of Chicago's illegal drug trade, trying to do something that would convince a court he was wronged by U.S. prosecutors or die in prison on a life sentence for racketeering conspiracy.
But according to DEA Special Agent Ray Donovan, there are no rights violations, just terrible conditions fitting for the most terrible criminals in the world. This is the kind of fate that a man responsible for unspeakable violence and death deserves. Thousands of people died or were ordered killed because of the Sinaloa cartel. So yeah, he doesn't leave his cell. It is boring. It's monotonous. It's very sad, but here's the difference. He's alive, and that means he could do plenty of things, unlike many of his victims. George Geweld Thomas.
Notorious and feared, George Geweld Thomas, leader of the 28's gang. His reach and influence stretched wide, from the Cape Flat streets to inside prison.
Compared to the Mexican drug lords, the South Africa leaders of the Numbers Gang might not sound as famous, but they're just as brutal, if not worse. The Numbers Gang in South Africa was founded in the late 1800s. Yep, you heard that right. Its initial goal was to protect black mine workers, reportedly. But members of the Numbers Gang have always been associated with robbery, extortion, assault, SA, smuggling, contract killing, trafficking, and murder. Throughout the 20th century, the Numbers Gang expanded into all South African prisons. Then, of course, whoever leaves prison recruits more people into the gang, and the numbers expanded outside jails too. The gang's main purpose are the 26s, 27s, and 28s. The 28s are the most brutal of them all. They are in charge of fighting and killing on behalf of all three groups. A simple initiation rule is stabbing someone to death, be it a prison guard or a rival gang member. That's the only way to become a high-ranking member. And low-ranking members are often called women and violated just to be humiliated. If you ask me, this just goes to show what kind of people the 28s are. Enter George Geweld Thomas. Geweld literally translates as violence. For decades, he terrorized Cape Town, violating, torturing, murdering, and leading the 28s gang with its long list of crimes. In the 2000s, the 28s were at an all-out war with the Clever Kids gang, so one of Thomas's main goals was to assassinate the Clever Kids' leader, Curtis Esterhuizen. After 6 assassination attempts spanning from 2008 to the early 2010s, Geweld Thomas was finally arrested. Much like El Padrino, Geweld was still able to run his mafia from prison. He was behind bars with Curtis's brother, who was dead. Curtis himself was also killed after surviving multiple attempts, including a shot to the head. Then, Thomas proceeded to order several murders of state witnesses who were due to testify against him, but this didn't go unseen.
Thomas was convicted on 52 charges, including 7 of murder. His trial was one of the biggest and most complex gang prosecutions in the province.
His long list of charges was not the only thing that stood out. His defiant, smirky expression also made headlines. George Thomas did not seem to care he was going to prison for the rest of his life. Was this a mask he put on in an attempt to hide his fear or frustration? Or was he simply a psychopathic murderer, happy to be in the spotlight? He was sentenced to 175 years behind bars. News outlets would report some people saw this too lenient as a sentence. The state was calling for at least 2 additional life terms for the racketeering charges. Geweld Thomas will never walk the streets again or run his gang from his prison phone. Still, it's disturbing to see how little remorse, guilt, or responsibility these people have. No matter the harshness of their punishment, they never seem to admit they wronged anyone. And there are few worse ways to wrong people than running a brutal, murderous gang. Hey, thanks for watching. What other deadly narcos do you know, and have they been arrested yet? Let me know in a comment, and before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.